welcome. My name is Tammy Wincup, and I'm the president of Protocol. Thank you for joining us today for our second of two events during the 2020 National Political Conventions. Last week, we dove deep on how tech companies could enable a more diverse and inclusive workforce. Today, we turn our attention to the economy and the role that tech can and should play in our growth. We have two panels. Our first with fabulous leaders across the tech supply chain. And then I again turn it over to my colleagues, Issie Lapowsky and Emily Birnbaum, for a policy and political panel. My continued thanks to our partner, ITI, its president, Jason Oxman, and his team for continuing to have their pulse on these complex tech issues. Please welcome Jason and so he can set the stage on the high-tech economy across America. Thanks for joining, Jason.
Tammy, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. The global COVID pandemic has highlighted the crucial need for investment in the infrastructure of the future. And as the world's leading voice for the technology sector, ITI is proud to partner with Protocol today for our continued important discussion on the vital public policy discussion that we must have in this election to drive our technology-enabled future. In conjunction with the political conventions, ITI has released a policy roadmap for candidates highlighting the most important public policy discussion we think that this election should feature. First, we want to have a discussion about improving resiliency by expanding broadband access nationwide and incorporating smart technology and infrastructure deployment. This includes next generation wireline broadband, it includes 5G and fiber optic cables. We need to streamline regulatory barriers, we need to increase spectrum availability, and we need to provide government incentives and funding to reach underserved areas. We also need to focus on investment in research and development in emerging technology like AI, quantum information science, additive manufacturing, and other digital innovations. I know we'll talk today about this morning's announcement from the administration of a $1 billion investment in quantum computing, an incredibly important step toward IT modernization and ensuring all Americans can access the latest in quantum computing power. We also need to focus on a flexible, risk-based approach to regulation to help facilitate trust and promote responsible and ethical deployment of technology. The amazing technology companies you're going to hear from today are a cross-section of the world's most innovative companies that we're proud to represent as the global trade association of the tech sector. Companies like Corning, which for 150 years has been innovating everything from the glass for the Edison light bulb to the windows on every American spacecraft since Mercury, to the ability to send information on lasers over fiber optic cable that makes our broadband connections that we're using right now possible. HPE, which makes the fastest supercomputer in the world, and since 1939 has been innovating the technology that makes the cloud possible today. SAP, which makes the software that is enabling us to work from home and learn from home, and governments to serve their citizens in a remote environment. And from its roots as Acorn Computer, founded in a barn in the English countryside, ARM is making the technology behind the processors that drive our smartphones. All amazing companies. And indeed, since our founding in 1916, ITI has been proud to represent these companies and to be the global voice of the technology industry. Tammy, I know you have a terrific event in store for us today. I want to thank you and the entire Protocol team for your continued phenomenal partnership in bringing the voice of innovation to this important policy discussion during the conventions. Thank you, and back to you.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it. Well, let's bring those panelists on that you talked about in terms of the companies here. So please help me welcome Michael Bell, Senior Vice President and General Manager at Corning, Brian Roach, Managing Director of U.S. Regulated Industries at SAP, Carolyn Herzog, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at ARM, and Glenn Rose, the Director of Science and Technology at HPE. Welcome. We are seeing a tale of two economies right now that we're hoping you can help share your perspective in here. We have markets at an all-time high, due in large part to tech IPO filings this week on fire, as Jason said, an announcement from the White House about new initiatives around AI and quantum computing, and the highest unemployment that we have seen in a very, very long time. I'm hoping you'll help me understand this from your part of the tech world. I want to better understand how you believe tech is helping us drive the economy. And Michael, let's start with you. Let's start with Corning and Corning's fiber optic cable. As people move to working from home over the last 5 months, how have you seen your role in the economy and what the role of fiber is in this world, in this economy?
Well, thanks, Tammy, and greetings from Charlotte, North Carolina. As it happens, this summer, we're marking the 50th anniversary of Corning's invention of low-loss optical fiber. And since that breakthrough, Corning has produced over 1 billion kilometers of optical fiber, enough to go to the moon and back over 1,000 times. In 2020, this web of optical connections has taken center stage as the world races to adapt to COVID-19. And over the last few months, as you asked, we've seen the global internet hits are up 70%. Streaming and web video consumption is up 35%. Wi-Fi calling is up 100%. And the application we're using today, Zoom's daily users have grown from 10 million to over 300 million. So just as we're doing now, people around the country are using tools like video conferencing, which work great if you have enough bandwidth and if you have enough upstream bandwidth. Increasingly, people are uploading as much information as they're downloading. And we believe network architectures will have to evolve to handle this kind of symmetry. In many areas of the United States, that's not a problem. About 1/3 of households now have access to direct fiber connection with gigabit speeds available in both directions. And that number will grow to roughly half of homes by 2025, we believe. But as you pointed out earlier, some communities are not so fortunate. Many homes in rural America are still connected by internet to the internet by copper, if at all. And I have colleagues living just a few miles outside of town who cannot use video conferencing like we are today. So it's true that many large cities, we also have so-called broadband deserts. You know, the tragedy of this is that communities without broadband get left behind economically. One study found that 14 communities with gigabit broadband enjoyed approximately $1.4 billion in additional GDP, or 50% more GDP growth in the year that was studied. You know, of course, on the flip side, those without broadband don't get that benefit. But the good news is that through innovation, true broadband is now possible for all communities. The cost of fiber to the home has dropped dramatically, and it continues to drop. You know, what's happened is that major carriers have brought fiber to the home to big population centers, and we've developed products and techniques that cut their deployment costs by about 75% over the last several years. And now those innovations can be used to help unserved communities get fiber too. And I think one of the speakers mentioned 5G, and as 5G advances, it can help serve on areas too, unserved areas as well. Because 5G networks are really just fiber networks with antennas on the end.
Yep.
Bring fiber close to the home, then they cover the last few feet wirelessly. And we've recently announced new products to speed 5G deployments, which include new hybrid cable with providing paths for both electricity and fiber connectivity. And that means fewer touches and attachments for carriers installing small cell antennas. And we're also working with Qualcomm on in-building 5G, which will dramatically have connectivity increase in office buildings, hospitals, hotels, university campuses, and other places. So I believe we in the Tech Center are doing our part by developing new products, but we need policymakers to do their part as well. So we can dive deeper into that later, if you like.
Absolutely. Michael, you've touched on a lot of different pieces that I think you know, is the backbone of what we're talking about here. We're going to come back to that 5G issue because I think it's one of the questions that we want to talk about. Brian, build on that, right? So SAP, you're in charge of the regulated industries, huge ones, healthcare, defense, education, government. Talk to me about enterprise tech and where you have seen in the pandemic and as we think about economic growth, where SAP falls onto that infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think you know, what we've experienced over the last months, as both Michael and Jason alluded to, connectivity obviously has become so critical to our economy. So the technology related to that, and then how, the tech sector has reacted to that in terms of offerings throughout that. SAP's motto is to make the world run better and improve people's lives. And I don't think I've ever been busier, in that domain, trying to work through the challenges that our customers face during this cycle. I think what we've seen in terms of the reliance upon technology, the reliance upon connectivity, but more importantly, the digitization of processes and business as we think about the back end to the front end connectivity, as well as just the kind of the global endpoint connectivity, is the importance of having that access to the information, to the systems, whether it be remotely or even just digitized. And so many of my customers and our colleagues in the government, much of our processes are still paper driven. We refer to them as the technological have and have not. Some of that for very good reasons, for regulatory reasons, but for the most part, this new world order has exposed that and exposed those processes that could not be digitized or need to be digitized, and then forcing employees to go into work environments where others were able to work remotely. So just broadly, I talk about connectivity, and Jason alluded to resiliency. I think having systems now that are cloud-based but highly resilient, so that they can handle these massive spikes in usage, massive spikes in downloads, massive spikes in user heavy industrial strength use over the application. So I think those are the things we've seen kind of at a foundation. Interestingly, SAP, I would say, has fallen into those arenas as well. And I find, the interesting things around this that have been exposed to me is, connecting, suppliers with need when we had the early days in New York where there weren't enough hospital beds. So, using our supplier resource networks and our sourcing networks to identify, where, typical suppliers may not find their way into these typical buyers. And so we got involved in that very early on. So very tactical with the pandemic. Kids that were no longer getting their food during a school day, and then having to create those connections in concert with our partner, Gen Youth, who is one of our altruistic partners, but building a network so that we could put the suppliers of those food sources with the need in the communities, and identifying that and getting people connected to those as well. We have a new acquisition in a company called Qualtrics that found themselves very involved, not only in the testing early on at the state level, so a number of states have built their solutions on our technology, but now quickly evolving that connectivity discussion through track and trace, back to work, back to campus. And candidly, I think, industry is looking at back to work. I mean, and I'm talking, these are now commercial solutions. And I think that's probably where we're going to see companies jump in, tech companies especially, where we can find that, that need, and making sure that, we have the all the health of our employees identified, and the mobile apps that can identify if you've come in contact with someone who's been exposed, et cetera. But that is going to become critical for us to go back to work, along with obviously the testing regime.
Agreed.
So, and then of course the vaccination, connecting supply chain through that.
Yeah.
So
let's talk about a different piece of the supply chain. Carolyn, bring us into, as you're seeing both in the pandemic and going forward, right? From an economic perspective, arms, semiconductors, microprocessors are powering so many of our different devices. Where does that go now in the post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic world? And how does a company like ARM help advance the economy for everyone?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here, and thanks for such a great introduction. A lot of people maybe haven't heard about ARM, but if you are in the semiconductor industry and if you're an engineer, you certainly have heard of us. And it was a great introduction, and it's a great time to build on what the other speakers have already said. We're coming up on our 30th anniversary too, so it's great to have anniversaries. And similar, I think, to SAP, where we sit, we really believe in building technology for good, and where we enable the technology industry is really where we're a provider to the rest of the technology industry. We enable and supply our technology and license our technology to over 1,000 partners who then are enabling these chips. So, where if you've ever heard Simon Segars, our CEO, speak, and where he's been talking about technology recently, is this convergence of 5G, IoT, and AI. And so there's really never been a more disruptive time since the Industrial Revolution is what we're seeing right now in technology. And, similar to what the other speakers were talking about, where we have people suddenly not only being disrupted in this technology, but suddenly working remotely and needing to use technology in a completely different way. There are those that are doing really well from a technology perspective and able to work remotely and see almost no disruption in how they're working. And those that are seeing, needing to work in a very different way. And, where ARM, is looking in particularly around 5G, 5G is being built for all things that are being connected, right? All these devices that are being connected, all this technology that is creating data. A few years ago, we were just talking about big data and we weren't talking about 5G. And all this data is being, created, and then people are trying to figure out how do you use this data, and it's being used in 5G in ways that we haven't yet even anticipated.
Right.
So when we talk about technology for good, using it in healthcare, using it for our governments, and how can the government make sure that we're enabling it for our government's use in ways that we want to make sure that it's being used for good. We also have to think about what's the immense responsibility that we're carrying along with that. And so ARM is thinking about that at the base level because we're so far down the stack, and thinking about, well, what is that potential future use? How are we making sure that people have that continuity of use as well?
And I think that each of you in some way has brought up 5G. Glenn, as you think about, Protocol did a recent interview with your CEO where he talked about the cloud is not the destination, it's the experience. How are you seeing HPE's role in moving organizations to the cloud and the complexity of that in different types of organizations, and what that means for the economy of those organizations and what their needs are?
Yeah, one of the mottos we have is a force for good, right? Helping change the world. If you look at, customers that have been thinking about cloud and what their experience is, we view the world as more of a hybrid, right? So you're looking at customers that'll have a cloud experience on-prem as well as with the cloud itself, right? So the benefits the customers see, the ability to, maybe they don't want to move an application workload yet to the cloud, right? So it's a security issue, maybe a compliance issue. So really, it's how do we help customers modernize and then also enable to become more agile as well. So it's about the cloud experience, which can be on-prem as well as through a cloud provider. Another area that we look at is hold on one sec, is helping customers become more competitive both in commercial and then also in the government space, right? So we have a really interesting offering called as a service. It's a consumption model, right, which can incorporate both hybrid and cloud as well. So it's really about helping customers get the cloud experience, and we help them with consulting, both on site, right, to be able to modernize our environment.
Yeah. I'm interested, last week we had a conversation around, as I talked about, around workforce, right? Much of what we're talking about is on the economic growth side, and the skills that your companies have is a huge part of the equation that we talked about. And Michael or anyone, please jump in here. I'm wondering, as you think about these innovations that need to come, including, potentially 5G and broadband, how you all are thinking about this conversation of onshoring versus offshoring around trade on this. Caroline, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of how it's made more complex as you think about innovation in your company.
We certainly think about it a lot. Over 70% of our workforce is engineering. And we think about it from the perspective of, the changing workforce. How do you get access to this talent? How is training happening? We've done a lot of work, and we think about, I come from the security industry. I mentioned that earlier. I spent 20 years working in cybersecurity before I came to ARM, which is a very different kind of company, because we are so heavily engaged in the engineering workforce. When Brexit happened, when we think about what's happening in our workforce in the United States, as we're thinking about changes in regulation and the possibility of doing more manufacturing in the semiconductor industry in the US, we're thinking about how do we make sure that we're getting that training ability. Diversity is a huge topic for us right now. How do we make sure that we're getting more diversity and training of a more diverse workforce to ensure that as we're looking at the potential for bias in AI and making sure that we're getting a more diverse workforce for engineers for the future. These are all topics that we're thinking about, and training for the future of engineers is very, very important for us. You know, at ARM, we're very connected to universities. We do a lot of research and collaboration with universities to ensure that that training and keeping the workforce live is constantly a collaborative process. We're constantly recruiting for we do a lot of graduate recruiting at ARM. So that's something that is very much top of mind for us.
Michael, I think about this topic as you go back to kind of these pipe deserts, right? Which is how are you all thinking about, I mean, there's a connection to this workforce conversation in 5G, right? And frankly, what the rural areas or even urban areas that you were talking about that don't have access, you and Brian were both discussing. You know, when you think about when you think about the future of that, what are the tangible things that tech, not just your company, but that we could be doing on those issues?
Well, I think one of the things I mentioned earlier from a public policy perspective, I think we have to face the fact that, this digital divide is real, and it's not just a geographic issue, it's also a socioeconomic issue. We recently read an article by Common Sense Media. You guys have probably seen it, about the digital divide. Basically says that 50 million students are attempting to learn remotely this year, and 30% of them lack the connectivity and real-time instruction with their teachers. And so as folks grow up in this environment, there's a significant portion of our population that's cut off from this kind of a growth economy. And so I think, we can provide the solutions, and in some of the cases, we believe public policy is necessary to help provide the funding where it's not as economically viable.
What about enterprises on that, Brian and Glenn? I mean, how are you seeing kind of these issues combined, right? Broadband, workforce, where you're trying to take innovation with your own companies. Then we talked a little bit about the White House announcement on AI. What are your perspectives?
So we have a really interesting product, and it's really where we see the marketplace going. It's the intelligent edge. So if you think about all of the, traditional compute that might be done in a data center, a vast majority of this we see going forward in the future is going to be done on the edge. An interesting product that we have that incorporates 5G as an edge line Aruba, we're able to monitor large groups of people as they come into an office space or into a lobby to see what their temperatures are, right? So that area, is going to be exploding over time, right? Using edge devices, wireless, 5G, there'll be a lot of use cases for that across the federal government, across commercial as well. So I think that'll be very impactful.
Yeah, and actually, Tammy, what we're seeing, other than, we talk about the digital divide, the haves and have-nots, the fact of the matter is even the haves are in a tough situation. We're running 60-year-old code in the federal government on COBOL and assembler. So really what we're looking to, and I think some of the discussion later is, we're really at a phase in this government, in this country with this government to really look at the IT infrastructure. I mean, we have to ensure that we can create an environment where we will have a sustainable, data-driven digital economy, a digital society. And so from that perspective, I think, we all enterprise will benefit, all citizens will benefit, but, we've talked about big data, data-driven, all the technologies that you refer to, AI, other. That's how you tap into the data. You have to have that data foundation that's exposable in a modern environment, in a modern data environment that can be exposed and exploited by those tools. And so there's just, to us, there's a lot of investment that needs to be made. That's what we're advocating for on the Hill. But overall, we see that the core, the foundation of the building really needs to be set in a good, solid telecommunications infrastructure, a good, solid data system infrastructure.
Let's continue on that, right? We've chosen to have these events during, the national conventions. tech sits now in a power center position at the intersection of tech. And certainly we find often that regulation lags the innovation of companies that but talk to me, each of you, around kind of the policy implications and the things that matter for your part of the supply chain. Michael, I'd love to hear from you from the infrastructure side and the fiber side.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. I mentioned the digital divide. That's one of the things that's really important to us, especially during these times when we see it. So, kids trying to get back to school and also be safe. And so a lot of districts are choosing some remote, if not all remote learning. And we have this massive problem and there's a correlation between the household income and the availability of connectivity. And I personally feel very strongly that broadband is as essential as electricity and gas and water. And that as a nation, we need to find ways to ensure that all communities have robust connectivity to the internet. I think AI is great and it provides so many benefits, but if you can't even connect at all, then you can't exploit those benefits, and we can't exploit and train the workforce of the future, as you mentioned earlier. I think there are two public policy actions that are crucial to advance this. The first is that Congress should provide broadband funding for unserved areas with a preference for symmetrical gigabit networks. And that's primarily because people are uploading as much as they're downloading. There are a number of bipartisan bills of that nature that have been introduced into Congress, so we're encouraged to see policymakers moving in that direction. The second one is that local governments have to do their part too, and that's streamlining permitting and avoiding excessive fees in order to encourage new networks to be built in their communities. It's just a fact of life that broadband providers favor communities that work with them and not ones that work against them. So municipal governments that are slow to change to deploy or charge big fees will invariably deter broadband deployment. So they should think about ways to work with broadband providers instead of against them. And I think those two actions would help align public policy with the needs of the internet users and pave the way to that universally robust broadband that we all desire.
I appreciate you bringing up state and local, right? Many of these conversations in big tech, we don't actually talk about. We talk about the national kind of coverage, but I appreciate that piece. Glenn, thoughts on, everybody's touched on 5G. How do we actually get it done? How does the tech community actually help that?
So I think, part of it is policies that help enable digital literacy with workforce, with K through 12, as well as just awareness at the local, state, and local government area as well, as Michael had pointed out. And I think just building out more robust use cases will help. Policies that maybe have co-design. If you take an example out of Department of Energy with Path Forward, they would invest to help move technology along faster and quicker. Well, maybe some areas where private industry along with government can do NRE type or co-design type things to help move technology quicker, out to consumers and the citizens as well. And then you're looking at the government itself being more mission and data driven. Back to what Brian was saying, I think that's very critical. It all begins with the data, right? That's the important piece, and being able to drive more of a mission in a data-driven government, I think would help be a compelling event for all of those type of technologies to become much more meaningful.
Before we move on, can you give us an example of a co-design, product that you have seen that has been kind of a partnership between government and private sector in this?
Going back, here's an example that was probably 15 or 20 years ago, right? The Department of Energy wanted to move one of the axes. It was the interconnect between large systems for high performance computing. This was like one of the original Path Forward awards. And basically they did a procurement out to, industry, right? So it wasn't just HPE, but it was industry, looking at how can we, if we fund, in this case, interconnects between large HPC systems, can we get advanced technology, sooner than if we just wait for it to, happen as it would normally through investments, through sales and that type of thing. So that allowed our roadmap, in our case, it was an interconnect that we developed some years ago, to move forward faster. Those types of things happen quite often in the HPC ecosystem, especially with the national labs and national security agencies. But those type of methodologies may be of a real benefit in other parts of the federal government to move technology roadmaps further, quicker, faster, helping us be more competitive globally, right? And those are usually matching fund type things.
Right, right. Brian, thoughts on that and how that works on the enterprise and software side?
I think back to the days, my DoD days, and we'd kind of transitioned to 6.2, 6.3 of R&D, and I'm sure Glenn and others have gone through those cycles as well as we try to stimulate some of that technological evolution. I think Glenn and Michael covered it well, but the net of it is there's work that needs to be done. I think there's infrastructure that needs to be established for this to be meaningful and effective broadly. I think we'll always have pockets of great success. And it's really, I think we're exposing is really the broader need, and how do we bring what were typically very high powered, I would say, scientific workloads and use cases now are being faced by education workloads in a remote environment that weren't really planned on that network before. So I think that's really it's the evolution of the use case, as Glenn pointed out, bringing in more and more robust use cases to drive the development.
And we're seeing this even span beyond just traditional HPC, right, Brian? There are civilian agencies, other accounts. A lot of this is impacting in areas that in the past maybe not so much. So that's exciting.
True.
Absolutely. Carolyn, what about on your side, semiconductor, microprocessors, kind of big internet, how do you see the policy, and what are the policies that you are watching very closely as we head into this election cycle?
So quite a few, and I think your point about the evolution of technology moving faster than regulation is very top of mind for us. So, every day more devices are being connected, they're doing more computing, and that's only going to escalate as 5G rolls out, and it's something we have to pay attention to. So in the first 25 years that ARM was in business, our partner shipped about 100 billion ARM-based chips. And then in the last 5 years, about 72 billion chips were shipped. And our CEO predicts that by 2035, we will have shipped about 1 trillion chips. So that is a lot of technology doing a lot of processing. And with 5G, that's just going to be even more chips, more processing. And at this point, we predict that even our lowest processing devices are capable of performing machine learning. And we talked a little bit about the importance of security, and security being thought of at the very beginning of development, because we think about the responsibility, we think about if we're not thinking ethically about security at the very base level, then somebody else is not going to be thinking about that, or they're going to be thinking about it in the capability of weaponizing a chip and doing malicious things. And we think about that in the context of machine learning and AI. So ARM released a security manifesto in 2017, and thinking about that partnership among technology companies, because obviously there's a bit of techlash and concerns about, what are technology companies not doing together that we could in partnership with government, and how can we work together? Because, the government can't regulate everything, right? There's going to be too much fragmentation of regulation at the state level if we don't think about these kinds of things together. So we know that there's the CHIPS bill moving through Congress right now. That's really incredibly important. The ability to bring manufacturing to the United States. ARM employs about 2,000 employees in the United States right now. The ability to bring more jobs in the semiconductor industry to the United States. The ability to bring more diverse jobs to the United States in the semiconductor industry would be incredibly powerful. Mm-hmm. Thinking about that in the security level, thinking about that in AI, we've produced an AI trust manifesto, which again, thinking about that at the partnership level across companies, all the foundational measures that we can think about in AI and ethics, whether that's thinking about that in terms of transparency, bias, and all the measurements in AI, those are incredibly important to us. So the more that companies can work together so that the government can regulate around that is going to be incredibly important to us.
Excellent. Carolyn and all of you, thank you. I mean, I appreciate, I think the one thing that you all brought up at the end, which I know that our next panel will get into, is the intersection, right, of the security and the cybersecurity piece, and certainly the internationalization of companies that you all help run that are not just here in the US, but are international and bringing tech innovation across the world. My thanks to all of you for joining us, for the work that you all are doing. And I turn it over to my colleagues, Issie Lapowsky and Emily Birnbaum, to continue the policy and political conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Emily, I think you're on mute.
Oh, hi everyone. Thanks. Thanks so much, Tammy, for a great panel. My name is Emily Birnbaum. I'm a tech policy reporter at Protocol, and I'm joined by Issie Lapowsky, senior reporter with Protocol, and two wonderful guests. We're going to be chatting today about the policies that can help shape the economy of the future. So first is Matt Lira, who is Special Assistant to the President for Innovation Policy and Initiatives with the White House Office of American Innovation. Matt is a tech policy expert in the White House. And we also have Alexia Jordan, the Innovation, Cyber, and National Security Analyst at the Lincoln Network. Alexia formerly worked in state politics in Illinois and has spent years thinking deeply about national security and tech issues. So before we start, I just want to say if anyone has a question for either of our panelists, please send them to us in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring it. So now, Issie, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And thank you everyone for being here. So Matt, I'm going to start with you. So you work in the White House Office of American Innovation, which I'm not sure how many people in our audience are familiar with, but you guys really started with this focus on modernizing government services and fostering innovation in the private sector. Obviously, so much has changed in terms of the economic reality that we're living through right now. And I imagine that must have somewhat reoriented the priorities of your office. So can you talk to me a little bit about how these last 6 months have sort of changed the direction of the Office of American Innovation? Are there new areas you're focused on now?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, thank you, Issie, Tammy, Jason, and the whole team for hosting us today and facilitating the conversation on these important topics. So to your question, I think obviously, dealing with sort of the national pandemic and the response to it has, moved a lot of things to kind of around on the priority list. But frankly, many of the underlying issues and concerns are things that have been worked on in the last several years, or things that were kind of well underway. And so the biggest change really wasn't a shift in terms of direction as much it was accelerating the need for progress to happen on a much faster timescale. And the second aspect of that, clearly, given what's been going on and what we're all experiencing, but frankly, from the vantage point of my office and the team that I work with, has just been the unbelievable outpouring of support, offers for support, ways that, to help from every stakeholder really in our country, and particularly in the technology community. It's been remarkable and frankly, somewhat moving to see stakeholders who don't always agree on every issue of the day, kind of raise their hand and say, how can I help? Or here's how I think I can help. And we've seen that from the C-suite all the way down to entry-level professionals throughout the tech sector and throughout our economy. So that's been really remarkable.
Can you give us some examples of what sorts of projects you're saying have been accelerated, that it wasn't reorienting, it was just really accelerating some projects?
Sure thing. I mean, clearly a great example there is around telehealth, where, this is something that, we were laying the foundation for through our interoperability and patient access rules, which were finalized earlier this year, and through the Blue Button Developers Project over at CMS and a host of other initiatives. But given what we've, given the national emergency, the initial response was to issue waivers and sort of permit emergency use authorization of telehealth technology by HHS and other federal stakeholders. And of course, we've seen remarkable uptick in the use of that technology. And then recently, in the last several weeks, we've taken steps to make some of those changes permanent, as many as we can, frankly, through administrative action. And then, of course, working very closely with our partners on the Hill on where legislative remedies are necessary. But the message has been loud and clear in that case, both from federal stakeholders where, again, the emergency use authorizations, and from the private sector. Last week, over 50 healthcare payers, signed a pledge that they would continue to support telehealth payment models in the long term. And so the combination of CMS and the VA as payers and the private sector payers really speaking with one voice around that. There's an example where I believe both from the perspective of the policy, but also from the adoption rates throughout the country, we're several years ahead of where we likely would have been sort of in calmer waters. And again, you see that in other sectors as well, but telehealth I think is a particularly good example.
Great. And you also mentioned, companies stepping forward and raising their hand. What are some ways that contribution has moved the needle? Like we've been hearing about the contact tracing efforts that have not necessarily completely gotten off the ground as much as a lot of people might have hoped. So what are some of the meaningful contributions to your mind?
Yeah, so in my view, well, first, given the equities that are kind of representative on the previous panel, we shouldn't take for granted the incredible work that's been done by private sector entities and governments, federal, state, and local, just on the backbone of this infrastructure. I mean, we've shifted a radical shift in user behavior with virtually no notice for most providers anyway. And, there have been hiccups every once in a while, but generally speaking, the internet infrastructure and digital infrastructure of the United States has performed, where it's installed and where, again, the digital divide is very real. But where that infrastructure exists, it has performed exemplary well, and that doesn't just happen. That is the result of a lot of work by people smarter than I who raised their hand immediately. And how can I help, and how can we prepare for what we anticipated was coming? And I think you see that in education as well. I could kind of go on and on, but there's in every sector you see people that again don't always agree, and I don't just mean that from a ideological perspective. I mean, even sometimes they're just voracious competitors in the private sector. And you're like, wait, those two companies are working together? And that sort of spirit of togetherness as a nation has been really, again, striking to behold throughout the economy in particular.
Got it. Okay, so I want to talk, obviously we can't have a conversation about the future of the economy without talking about the role of China and Chinese companies in that economy. And right now, TikTok is sort of acting as a proxy for US-China relations. It's emerged as one of the few true competitors to social networks like Facebook and YouTube, but it's also facing this potential ban if it doesn't sell in the next few weeks. So Matt, I'll start with you and then I'll kick it to you, Alexia. Matt, why should the US government be in a position of controlling what people have on their phones? And isn't that sort of similar to what China does in terms of controlling technology within its borders?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Well, first of all, I just disclaimer, I probably shouldn't comment on the specific case that you referenced just because it's an ongoing matter involving various processes. But sort of the broader view of that issue is point well taken. I think that first and foremost, we need to make sure that the digital ecosystem in our country is secure and that it protects sort of the ground rules that generally we agree on as a tech sector. Long before there was administration action on this, there were many concerns raised around a variety of issues with whether it's intellectual property or cybersecurity from the tech sector about specific actors. And so I think it's important that we come up with ultimately free market solutions to those problems, but we do need to make sure that that we take them seriously as well. I guess my last bit on that is, no one would have thought in the 1970s that America would lose the lead in manufacturing that we possessed at that time, and yet 20 years later we were where we were. And so that's a combination of policy and business decisions and the rest, consumer decisions. So that's not on one specific decision. But I think when it relates to the digital economy, we need to be very mindful of that ecosystem that has created the companies like Facebook, Google, and the other American companies you referenced, and that any entrant into that field, whether they be American or global, kind of agrees to our ground rules.
Alexia, what do you make of the administration's moves against TikTok and WeChat? Do you think this is the proper way to be handling a potential challenger to Facebook and to these other companies because they happen to be based out of, their parent company happens to be based out of China? Is this the right way around it, or are we edging close to what China does with its own citizens?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question, and I definitely want to agree with a lot of Matt's points. But the thing is that it is not a yes or no answer, like this is good or bad. So it is a really nuanced thing, and it needs to be taken as such by this administration and whatever next administration that is coming in. So why is it bad? So I understand from the intelligence and national security perspective, this isn't us trying to control American citizens. This isn't us trying to make sure Facebook or Twitter has a leg up. It's literally the acquisition of a mosaic of intelligence that is being gathered by TikTok videos. It seems silly, 13-year-olds just kind of like making videos, my friends making dance videos. It's like, it's all cute and fine, but you're getting real-time information from citizens across the globe and in the United States. And just to really echo the last panel, that is a problem when we don't have particularly strong network security protocols as is, right? So if you think about the information that can be gathered from social media networks domestically, which we already had a problem with before we started with TikTok and WeChat, right? And then we add in the information that these added social media networks are getting with the information that's already been stolen from American citizens from so many spaces. I mean, you know, like literally stores like Kohl's, Target, Home Depot, the ones that have been hit over the last several years, to the nation state hits on our information, Equifax, OPM, right? Veterans Affairs. So I understand from that perspective. That's why we need to, you know, kind of be very wary. But in the exact same breath, we cannot consistently do a tit for tat with China. The competition with China is going to be and is a long-term strategic one that's going to affect a lot of American interests and a lot of American security. So, you know, and they're also going to be a long-term partner, you know, with their status. And we're going to have other partners, you know, potentially India in the future, right? So our focus cannot be this consistent tit for tat. It needs to be on American agility, our development, figuring out our long-term goals and making us stronger and safer. Because even if the rise of China didn't happen, even if TikTok wasn't a thing, our networks would still be vulnerable. We've still gotten hacked. Russians, North Koreans, Iranians, Americans, right? So this isn't a China exclusive issue. This is us. We need to keep our own house secure issue. And they just so happen to be the thing for the day. So I do understand from an intelligence perspective, let's be a little bit wary. In the exact same breath, we cannot keep doing this tit for tat thing.
So we've actually got an interesting question in the Q&A. So this is from W. Patrick Wilson. So the question's posed to Matt, but I think either of you can weigh in on it as well. Given recent actions at Commerce to restrict U.S. commercial product sales in China, do you worry that this action will, one, increase desire to remove all U.S. technology from products like in the aerospace industry? This is the first question. And two, encourage even more investment from the Chinese government to further develop and accelerate their own technological innovation. So more on this sort of like tit for tat, the effects of the moves against China that we're making in the US. So first to Matt and then to Alexei, if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I think obviously there's going to be, the details are going to matter a lot on how we handle this as a nation. In my view, sort of big picture, we need to make sure that we have a concerted and frankly, relatively agreed upon national strategy related to the challenge of preserving America's global leadership in technology. So as a baseline, you know, we need to, and this was the way, you know, Issie will maybe recognize this, that I've said this in the past, but, you know, the 1950s, the Cold War, you know, starting really the 1940s, the 1950s through the, you know, the Bush administration, you went from like Eisenhower to JFK to LBJ, you know, Nixon, Carter, or excuse me, to Ford to Carter to Reagan, Bush. I mean, wildly different presidents, wildly different personalities, wildly different political coalitions throughout that history. And yet our fundamental national security and technology innovation strategy was largely the same throughout that entire period. And so as we enter sort of a new era of technological competition and collaboration with China and other countries, we need to develop that policy consensus in the United States to be as robust as it was during that era as well. To the specific question, I think it's something that we'll have to continue to monitor. At the same time, I don't think we can ignore the activities of various global actors, and and let our wishful thinking, well, if only we give them a chance to be better, that then things will improve. I think we need to take this very seriously and frankly matter-of-factly as it relates to behavior around intellectual property concerns in particular, and deal with the consequences that may create.
Yeah, I really want to echo Matt on the importance of continuity planning and long-term strategic goals on this. Yeah, I'll hold it there.
Okay, great. Just one more follow-up question is sort of like the future of where this is heading. Is the future of where this is heading, there's no role for Chinese technology, for Chinese technological products on US soil? Are we just going to completely, separate ourselves from a rival due to these hacking concerns? Or do you see a future in which diplomatic tides turn and we find a way to work together again, particularly on things like 5G or infrastructure issues?
Yeah, so the seriousness of the tech competition with China is not lost on me. It's not, and I don't want any type of miscommunication about that. But the idea that there can be a bifurcation, that there can be two internets, doesn't make sense for anybody's strategic plan. So the president, the executive branch just came out with the Clean Networks, proposal, right? Sounds perfectly fine. Get all of this Chinese equipment out of our systems, work with our allies to make sure that their intelligence and their networks are safe, right? That sounds fine, but if you just got to think a step beyond that. So then what are you asking? You're asking the other 192, 192, 193 countries to choose sides. How is that going to bode well for us? And the assumption that everyone is going to choose America is a bad assumption to make. It's also not a good assumption to think that everyone is going to choose China. It's not a good idea, I think, to put ourselves into that position, nor to put our allies and not allies and frenemies into that position. Because if we have two different worlds, then let's just imagine maybe the EU and the UK say, okay, cool, we're just only going to rock with American companies and Japanese companies and Nokia and Ericsson, and that's how we're going to keep everything safe. But they have their own alliances with other countries that are not a part of our alliance. And that when we talk about network security, do you know what I mean? Like, it gets extremely messy. So the idea that you can separate is, it's just, when you think about it down the line, it really presents entirely too many questions and entirely too many struggles that I just don't think anyone has the answer to. And it's not because anyone is more or less smart than anyone else. It's just like, how are you going to tell France that they can't communicate with a country that they have alliances with when we don't, but they're still a very important strategic partner to us? Like, we can't do that.
Matt, just not to interrupt, but Matt, I'd love to hear you respond to Alexia's concerns about clean networks.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, we just need to have very clear-eyed about the underlying behaviors and ensure that, the United States and our closest allies are, making sure that our equities are protected there, and that the behaviors ultimately reflect both our values and our national security interests. There's some room for flexibility there over time as a policy matter, but that underlying data point shouldn't be sacrificed, in my view. I would also say I generally am an optimistic person, so I'm frankly optimistic that have a very serious substantive discussions and exchanges with a variety of global partners, including those closest to us and those that have not been, that ultimately we may find ourselves in a position where we're able to resolve this in a way that preserves the global nature of the network that Alexia was describing. I am very heartened by the support that, frankly, some of these initiatives have received in the United Kingdom, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and in a host of other countries. I think this concern about these baseline behaviors by any global actor is something that is just genuine, and the global community is right to take it up.
Great. Well, I'm aware we spend a lot of time on China, but I think it's really important. So thank you guys. But I do want to switch to talk about another critical topic, which is schools. So Alexia, kids are going back to school right now at a time when technology has never been more critical. And yet we have millions of kids with no devices, no high-speed internet. And we have not seen much by way of Congress doing much about that over these last few months since the initial stimulus. So tell me from your position, what changes need to be made today at the federal level to really get kids learning online?
Yeah, I used to be a teacher. I used to be a teacher for, a long time. And I deeply empathize. I still have a lot of friends that are, and they are struggling. Like, some kids can, like the previous panelist said, have one-on-one teaching, and then the other kids can't, and you just literally don't know what to do. And it's scary. So when I think about policy changes that need to happen today, if this helps at all, I really do think about the buildup of our networks from a grand strategy perspective. And that helps me think about narrow down what needs to happen today, tomorrow, and in future generations, right? So there needs to be a lot of support and funding for new forms of interconnectedness and broadband, things that will help regional and local providers get quicker access to, the upcoming networks, 5G, et cetera. And that is going to happen with, in my opinion, government support and public-private cooperation. So then once you kind of get all of that happening, and you start thinking about that on a very large scale, then you come down to okay, this means that we need to support, I'm from Chicago, so we need to make sure that CPS has, oh, hold on, I'm sorry, let me back up. What internet is being used by the students that attend CPS schools? Go ahead and get that list, figure out which companies are doing well in the areas where the kids live, because we have access to the ISPs, we have access to the addresses of the children, and we have access to the city of Chicago. And of course, I'm just using this as an example. But you can see who is struggling and put the resources and the infrastructure in those places. And like the previous panel said, I think Matt mentioned it earlier as well, we are so indebted to all of the telecommunications ecosystems that have stepped up amidst COVID. And now they just need added support. But that added support isn't just shuffling them more money. It is thinking long-term about, hey, at the same time, we're building future technologies to maybe give more access to 5G as it comes along. We can, at the same time, build what you have so that we don't have to take down old infrastructures as 5G is coming up. You can do this hybrid scenario and still expand access to kids while still achieving, longer term goals.
Matt, from your perspective, I think what Alexia is talking about, to your point, it is a lot about the longer term view, but right, a lot of kids are already back to school now, or going back to school after Labor Day. What is happening from the White House, Congress, Department of Education, or even, I don't know if you're working with state governments, what is happening right now to get those kids online?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just disclaimer, and I'm always upfront when it's not something that I'm a particular expert in education policy is that for me. So I'll be enough to give you the general flavor, but I think generally speaking, you saw in the initial stimulus act that went through, there was significant funding for connectivity to educational institutions. I think it was about 13.5 billion just to the Department of Education alone. From my perspective, there's the things that need to happen now, today, what are the solutions for the students today or in the next few weeks? If they don't have connectivity, and it's great to say that we should pursue policies that get them connectivity in the near future, but what are they going to do today? And for my mind, those kind of emergency investments that Congress has made in those emergency acts are incredibly well taken, and I think we need more of that activity. The FCC has, I know, led on this issue as well within their authority. So those investments, I think Michael and the other panel referenced the digital divide, and I think that's a very real phenomenon that we shouldn't take for granted, and we need to work as a nation to close that gap with a combination of public investment and public policy and private free market solutions. You know, think about unserved areas exist primarily because in this country because it's not economically sustainable for a private market actor to provide service in those areas. And there's sort of two ways to solve that problem, both of which have a role. One is to provide public support for the infrastructure investment necessary to make it to connect those places, and you see that through FCC funds and the rest. The second is to look at sort of what are the underlying causes for that lack of affordability for that business model. And in some cases, it's the permitting process. In some cases, it's that the technology isn't mature yet to provide alternative ways of connectivity. And so aggressively pursuing those two pathways has been sort of the heart of our approach. Doing as much permitting reform as we can, and then as many significant investments in the R&D infrastructure of the United States. When you think about the national innovation strategy as a whole, R&D is really a foundation to that. And the industries of the future, as we like to call it, will be those technologies that determine not just for education, but also healthcare, transportation, finance, media. I mean, really every sector of our economy. It will be shaped by these industries of the future: AI, 5G, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing, among others. And so we've prioritized the R&D investments in those areas to get the technological solutions. One, to make sure we're, to our previous discussion, remain the global leader in those technologies, but two, help provide the very real solutions that people need for problems like this one.
Issie, Matt just reminded me when he talked about the money that went to the Department of Education, some of the most beautiful things that I've seen, and it also kind of answers the question earlier about what type of, interaction and collaboration have you seen from the public and private sector. So in Chicago, they started, raising their hands and saying, hey, well, they're asking people to raise their hands and say, hey, who quite literally doesn't have a laptop at home? Who doesn't have a computer at home? All right, cool. Put your name on a list. We got you. We will help you. You don't have access to internet. Like there were several internet service providers that literally just made a mobile Wi-Fi truck. And then if you wanted to come bring a folding chair and sit in the parking lot or sit in this library, and now there is space to be on the internet in a park, outside, in a library, in outdoor seating restaurants. Those types of things are absolutely brilliant. Also, I think Matt mentioned earlier, there have been tons of organizations, and I'm not sure where their funding came from or if it was completely altruistic, but when I went home to visit, they had food giveaways absolutely everywhere because from my community, there were tons of babies that weren't getting fed. So when we talk about things that need to happen today, I love when I see those types of innovations happening. And that was allowed to happen from my perspective because it was already clear in Chicago and Illinois, you guys weren't going back to school. And that is how you can help teachers prepare for what they need to look like. I have some friends that are teaching in other states and they're literally sitting here like, I just got my instruction and I'm supposed to start school in 2 weeks.
Well, that's really my question is, I think what you're describing are these sort of philanthropic, laudable efforts by, wealthy individuals or companies to provide these stopgaps. But in order to actually scale those, solutions, would both of you agree, and you can give me a thumbs up or a yes or no, that it doesn't really happen without more stimulus funding? Matt?
Yeah, well, I think it's.
I get 2 thumbs up. Matt said,
I'll leave that to Mr. Meadows and the president to negotiate those provisions. But clearly, I think I'm on safe ground saying that we want to see smart investments in these areas to fill the gaps. The program, one of the incidentally you mentioned, the USDA Farmers to Families program, which is a food box program to take. It helps both the farmers because they have this excess inventory from the changing in the demand in the agricultural sector, and of course it helps families get the food. And so that's an example facilitated by USDA where the ability to make change at scale is something that uniquely exists in public institutions.
Yeah. And outside of that, because I mean, that is obviously a great example. I think that you know, from the federal level or even from the state level, but from governors, like people need advance notice about what, and I know that's just so ridiculous to ask out of people, as we know things change day by day with COVID. I get it. But to really prepare people, businesses, schools, babies, teachers, you know, like as I think about 2021, they need to already know whether they're going to be in school or not October, you know, and start planning for that prior. And it doesn't matter what administration is going on, like you need to just sit here and plan for that prior so that then we can get that type of coordination going. That's all.
Well, sorry to bring up a very large topic a little bit before we are, scheduled to end, but I do want to talk a little bit about 5G and what it's going to take, to get to a place where 5G is available and mainstream in the U.S. So starting with Matt, most hardware providers of 5G beyond Qualcomm and Apple are foreign. So where is investment going, and what needs to happen over the next 10-ish years to make America competitive in 5G with American products?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It's, as I say, it's one of the core industries of the future. So first and foremost, the investments in the R&D in that sector, I think we've made substantial public investments through national labs and the National Science Foundation, et cetera. That needs to continue, and if anything, it needs to continue to grow. Second, and we saw this, I believe, last week or the week before, spectrum allocation matters a lot, and that important sort of mid-band spectrum availability. The Department of Defense recently, working with the FCC and of course the White House, was able to come to an agreement on freeing up some of that spectrum and being able to redeploy it for 5G purposes. So the combination of the mid-band spectrum and the C-band spectrum auctions, hopefully this year, I think will have a very significant effect on the availability of 5G in the United States. And third, and sort of something that I always come back to, we need, part of what will make this ecosystem successful in terms of competitiveness is not taking for granted the innovation ecosystem that we have in this country and the ability for startups to be created that leverage that technology in a way that provides value for end users, whether they be enterprise customers or consumer customers. And the combination of inventing the technology through R&D, whether public or private, deploying the technology, as I said, through spectrum auctions and other public policy investments, but then also of course private investments, and then three, making that technology matter to people's daily lives. We have an incredible track record as a country in doing all three of those things exceptionally well in the innovation sectors. And as we continue to confront what I would call, I guess, the policy challenges of the last wave of technological innovation, particularly here in Washington, we have to make sure that the choices that we make don't prohibit America to lead the next wave of policy innovation. And so the 5G is a good example of that. The ability for startups that leverage 5G technology to not only be created and exist, but to thrive at a unicorn level is something that we shouldn't place arbitrary administrative burdens on, even as we deal with the very real issues in more mature aspects of the tech sector. Kind of what I like to say is, the obligation of public policy in this area is to make sure that the next Steve Jobs, when she creates it in her dorm room or a garage or a coffee shop, is somewhere in the United States. And we shouldn't take that for granted. And if we do that right, then I wouldn't bet against America's leadership in 5G.
I wanted to talk about one specific initiative within 5G, which is Open RAN. It's a software-based initiative that could allow multiple companies to participate in the 5G market rather than rely on hardware for one company. Obviously, there is some disagreement about the potential of Open RAN within the Trump administration. Some officials tout the initiative as a boon. Some say it's a pie in the sky idea. So first Matt, and then first Alexia, and then Matt. Do you think Open RAN could offer the solution to concerns, about America's future in 5G and whether we'll lead that globally?
Yeah, of course. So I really want to It does. It 110% does. And I think that, you know, what Matt said at the end supports it. So we need to leverage small companies that want to use and get access to the network. Well, that is 110% a great thing. The thing is that people want to sit here and use different 5G, you know, works and products. Everything is proprietary. So if you just sit and open up the components of the radio access network, then that is going to create an entire new market, an entire new level of entrance, a reduced a barrier to entry, which is great. And that creates that next cycle of jobs that we're talking about. So it is not a pie in the sky idea, primarily because it was driven out of innovation by alliances between the entire telecommunication ecosystem in America and abroad. And, you know, when we talk a lot about, oh, like 5G, America needs to win the 5G thing, to me, that takes out of context what we actually need from 5G, which is, you know, internet connection, good economic security, and like a boost, right? So we were not the first ones to come out with 1G. What was it? Korea? Japan? Who did it first? Anyway, it was Japan in 1979, and then Korea was the first to come out with 5G. But we're still doing extremely well in it. So it's not about who gets to it first; it's about who leverages the benefits of it first. And if we toy with ORAN and at least give it an opportunity, see, that's kind of the thing about. And I worked in politics, like I worked in government. I'm sorry, in politics. I get it. But legislators really need to wrap their head around the idea that there is not one answer to tech problems. There's not one answer to security issues. Everything, as long as it is backed and supported, especially by the private sector, who's doing the majority of the funding for this right now, and doing hybrid tests across the nation and even across the globe, you need to sit here and roll with different options and see what happens. So ORAN is an excellent idea to pursue. It's been touted by, you know, ITIF, ITIC, where else did Lawfare, telecom, FCC is literally gonna host an open discussion on ORAN in September. You know what I mean? This is not a unproven thing. This is something that can actually work, increase market, increase vendor diversity, which then gets to an entirely different conversation about security, network security, cybersecurity, and cloud security, because you need to have vendor diversification to increase security measures. And this is just, I just honestly, I can't see another idea. ORAN is a good idea, and other good ideas will come, but you just need to pursue one. And this is a pretty darn good one to start with.
Matt, is there anything you'd like to add on ORAN?
I guess just generally, you know, I don't think the government should pick necessarily a single winner or loser in these kinds of issues. Obviously, the ON discussion is something that is very happening. It's a very robust discussion in the administration, as you alluded to. I think that will continue. And frankly, it's a robust discussion in the broader Washington policy community writ large. Generally speaking, my personal predisposition is to try to create a framework where, you know, the marketplace and the innovators themselves are able to drive decisions around, you know, technology standards, platforms, and the rest. You know, as I say, the United States has a fantastic track record of trusting innovators to do innovative things, and we should remember that. I think, generally speaking, if, you know, global leadership in the 20th century came down to who wrote better 5-year plans, I don't know if the United States would have won that category, but fortunately it came down to sort of other metrics, and I think the same will be true in this century.
Yeah, and I really want to agree with you there, Matt. And that's I think another beauty of this is that it's not picking a winner. This ORAN isn't a company or a thing. It is an idea that is being explored by tons of people. So it was, you know, collabed in the early days with ISPs and Facebook and Amazon, you know, people in the ecosystem who still, you know, kind of like go back and forth, and there's this type of competition. And now the alliance spans the entire telecom ecosystem, and that's beautiful. And what's really good about it, in my opinion, is that it plays to American strengths. So our American companies in the telecom space built all of this proprietary tech, and opening the RAN is literally just going to give them more options for new companies who want to leverage that standardization of the radio access network interfaces to come and buy more of their products. And that also gives space for international collaboration in the private sector, which is what we need to, if we want to enact the clean networks proposal, okay, that's great. If we want to think more about alliance and our telecommunication security, these are bigger ideas that go into our larger grand strategy, and ORAN is led by the private sector, and that can help nudge us in those negotiation directions.
Well, we're up against our time, but given that we are in convention season, Matt, I just wanted to end with you. You either have a couple months left in your job or 4 more years. So what do you hope to accomplish in these next few months as we head to the election to either set your next 4 years up for success or to set the next administration up for success when it comes to all these ideas we've been talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. The country gets to go through the broader choices they make every now and again. And, I'm not here to talk about that, but generally speaking, my goal for the next several months is to make sure that the United States government, well, one, does everything we possibly can with every moment we can, for as long as we've got the clock. And secondly, that we're positioning the country for success in 2021 and beyond. I think, there are things that, from a public policy perspective, can only be achieved in the first year of a term. And so next year will be the first year of a term, whether it's a second term or first term. And so my personal objective, and I think a lot of people on the team, is how do we position the country to really make meaningful progress in 2021 by laying the foundation for that today. I felt that, for example, that was the case at the VA in 2017, or sort of late 2016, a fantastic team of professionals there, some from career civil servants, some were term hires from various outside entities. They put together a plan for modernizing the VA's digital infrastructure. So in December during transition, and in January 2017, we really were able to just go and do it. And it, of course, now has been implemented. And there are going to be opportunities to do that. We didn't touch on it as much in today's discussion, but some of the issues raised on the earlier panel on just our core digital infrastructure as a nation, it needs a lot of work. We've made progress. I think we've made serious progress in specific cases. But I like to say that we're sort of in the 5th year of a 10-year journey as a country, building an institutional capability for change management with how we leverage technology, federal, state, local. And that involves, how do we actually do that? It involves who actually does it, and it involves how do you pay for it? And we've made progress on all 3 of those points. But I think there's still more work to do. And what I would argue, and there's probably not time to go into all details now, is we have, building on the last 5 years, we have proven that a strategy can work, and it can work at an enterprise scale. So it isn't a pilot project that's awesome, but that affects 1,000 users. We have done enterprise level transformation based on 5 years of work by, again, an amazing cadre of professionals. The next 2021 and beyond in that issue category, I think, is really about scaling it, so that the technical debt that we've seen throughout our society as we dealt with this crisis in the public sector can be sort of paid off, and we can leverage the best technology to serve the people that make the decisions that you alluded to at the start of your question. So if we can do that, then I'll be happy with the next several months in terms of that work.
Great. Well, we'll have to have you back to talk about government modernization, because I know that is also your
always.
So thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alexia. Thank you to our audience and our earlier panelists. We hope you guys learned something today, and please continue to follow our coverage on all of these topics on protocol.com. Talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.